Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. It's my great pleasure to introduce Michael. I was touched by your invitation for me to introduce you, Michael, because whether you know it or not, you were part of my introduction to Aotearoa when I first came here to take up the job at AUT of senior lecturer. I arrived on 14th of July, 2009. And on the 20th of July, I was ushered into a room to do some teaching. And Michael was one of the first group of students that I had the privilege to get to know. And I thought at the time, this is a rather lovely young man. He's very thoughtful. And I think in terms of dealing with the subject of ecotherapy in his dissertation, most creative and innovative. I was thinking about the karakia you offered, Susan, and I was thinking about that. It's always struck me that in Aotearoa, with perhaps so much attention to the land, or perhaps we might think there needs to be so much attention to the land, and the idea of aroha, that if we could express that love for the land and the land's love for us, we might be in better shape. But as we're not, I think it's great that Michael and others are helping us to think about eco-psychology and ecotherapy in relation to psychotherapy. And the other connection for me is that Michael's partner, Selina, is also doing a dissertation, and I'm very privileged to be supervising that. Again, great creativity and thoughtfulness about the subject of eco-psychology and ecotherapy. So this is a young couple who I think are the future of some synergy between the eco and the psycho. So without further ado, I have great pleasure in introducing and presenting Michael Apathy. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith and Susan. Yeah. Am I close enough to the mic here? That's better, isn't it? So, I'd like to start with a story. Daedalus was a great inventor who had been imprisoned by King Minos of Crete within the walls of his own invention, the labyrinth. But the great craftsman's genius would not suffer captivity. He made 2 pair of wings by adhering feathers to a wooden frame with wax. Giving 1 pair to his son Icarus, he cautioned him that flying too near the sun would cause the wax to melt. But Icarus became ecstatic with the ability to fly and forgot his father's warning. The feathers came loose, and Icarus plunged to his death in the sea. So, I've started this talk with the story of Icarus and Daedalus because for me it captures the tragic shadow side of our culture's belief in ascendance, transcendence, and heroic individualism. And the ancient Greek word for this was hubris. Today, Icarus is shown on the bankruptcy court of the Amsterdam town hall, where he symbolizes high-flying ambition. And though the modern, still simmering global financial crisis is not unrelated to what I'll be talking about, what I'll be focusing on is environmental and personal suffering and the discipline of ecotherapy, where these 2 forms of suffering and the healing of them intersect. So the story of Icarus and Daedalus points to one of the 3 major ideas of this talk, that of tragedy, which is the dramatic flip between positive and negative, which is symbolized and then communicated through story. The second major idea is that of awareness, arising in relation to our sensory environment as ecological awareness. And the third major idea is that of the ground, so the stuff, the place, the space, the physicality of us and the physical world that surrounds us. And as I hope to show, these three ideas really interrelate, and I'll be weaving them through the talk today, which will take the form of a story. And the story is my journey, really, of beginning to practice psychotherapy here in Auckland as if the earth matters. So my starting point in the story will be the talk I gave last year, actually, at the NZAP branch meeting. From that, I'll move on to the development of an ecotherapy peer supervision group. Then the Circle of Change initiative, which I'll explain. And finally, the running of a nature immersion ecotherapy workshop called Deep Green. So that's the territory we'll go over. And we'll start this by reversing Icarus's ascent. So by descending to look at the state of the earth, the ground upon which we depend. To do this, I'll repeat a part of my talk last year at that branch meeting. And I'll do that for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because I'll be interested to see from the same starting place if we can, as a group, end up somewhere different, somewhere further along the path of being able to sustain ecological awareness. Secondly, I'll repeat this part, this scenario of a likely future, just because it's still relevant. The most recent research I looked at confirms that, which was a study by the World Bank, published late last year. So the latest climate predictions and global warming models confirm that the scenario I'm about to describe is one that we're likely to arrive at this century, somewhere between 2050 to 2100, to 2100, when we reach the point of a 4-degree rise in temperature globally. So that time frame means, if not within our lifespan, then probably within our children's lifespan. Presenting this information is an experiment, really, to see if we can, as a group, hold this information and our responses to it. And if so, if we can find out what it is that's helping us to sustain that ecological awareness. The map you're just seeing shows what the planet will look like if the Earth warms by 4 degrees, which, as I said, we can expect somewhere between 2050 to 2100. The yellow areas are predicted to be uninhabitable deserts. The brown areas are also uninhabitable due to extreme weather conditions. The red areas are underwater. As you can see, all of the world's major deserts are predicted to expand, with the Sahara reaching right into Central Europe, which will be useless for agriculture. Hardy creatures such as goats may be able to be grazed at the fringes. The Amazon rainforest will be transformed into a desert. Alligators will bask off the English coast. the vast majority of the world population and world cultures will be either displaced or perished. The acidic seas will be largely devoid of fish due to a crash in plankton quantities. Human habitation will only be possible at the northern and southern extremes of the planet. And we can't know this from climate models, but it's likely that these dramatic changes will bring widespread territory and resource wars and a significant die-off in the global population. In my talk last year and in the discussion we had afterwards, we processed some of our reactions to this. The sense of horror, fear, sadness, numbness, anger, or a sense of overwhelm. We also looked at the way we might protect ourselves from these feelings with denial, dissociation, projection, the manic response, and so forth. My own experience is that it's very hard. It's a very hard task to think and feel about death, and more so about what we're talking about here, which is death on such a scale that it would kill off entire cultures. So my interpretation of what happened when we became aware of this as a group last year is that the figure and ground flipped. And our actual ground, the environment, came into focus in an uncomfortable way. People, including myself, seemed to me to flip quickly and easily between extremes, such as hope and despair. The flip back from focusing on the precarious state of the ground we depend on to reconnecting with human ingenuity and empowerment didn't, to me, seem to happen when we looked at this before. So why not? I've got a couple of answers, and we'll have time for discussion at the end, and I'd really love to get feedback from you all if you have thoughts on these. The first answer relates to a clue that I got when someone gave me feedback after the talk that they thought there was some idealization of me going on in that process. And that's actually really hard for me to say to a group of psychotherapists who mostly have a lot more life and professional experience and skills than me. So, if it is true, why would people such as yourselves potentially idealize me in talking about this? On a surface level, it probably sounded, and maybe sounds now, like I know what to do about environmental crises like global warming. And for the record, I don't. But perhaps on an unconscious level, I represented the figure of the young Icarus, who could soar away, escaping deadly threats on the ground. And I may have even had enough of a sense of hubris to accept this role on an unconscious level. The environmental movement has a history of creating Icarus-like figures. For instance, the young activist who you'll see, Julia Butterfly, who some of you may have heard of, she spent 738 days in the branches of a giant California redwood tree in a successful attempt to stop it from being logged, despite the logging companies trying various tactics to dislodge her, including trying to knock her out of the tree with helicopters. and the height of the fall would have certainly killed her. And it's worth noting that although the way that story has been told makes Julia Butterfly seem like a heroic lone actor, she was actually very dependent on support people and a broader environmental movement to accomplish what she did. My second possible answer to why a flexible figure ground awareness is difficult to maintain continuously around issues like global warming is that global warming itself is a radical threat to continuity. The continuity of our lifestyle and the species itself. Compounding this is the difficulty of our being continuously confronted by the stuff of our lives that can challenge or disrupt us. And I'll need to explain what I mean by the word stuff. So, trying to avoid the problematic word nature, ecotherapists have coined phrases like the more than human or the other than human to talk about the contents of the environment or background to human life. So instead, I'm going to use the word stuff, which for me captures the casual, ordinary, familiar qualities that we experience through our habitual relationship with the majority of the matter in the universe. It's the stuff that cannot laugh at our jokes, that can't like our Facebook page, or can't lend us a raincoat. So as soon as we leave an environmental presentation with our level of ecological awareness raised, the stuff of our lives begins to challenge us. We might drive away in a car, the use of which defines the world of friends, family, green space, and opportunity that are within our reach. To resort to walking, cycling, or public transport is in some ways to become a disabled person. To ask for a ride in someone else's car impinges on our adequacy as a self-sufficient adult, putting us in the position of a beggar, a child, a poor or otherwise marginal person. To explain our reason for such a decision is to accuse those who do drive of destructiveness, which may come across as an act of aggression or possibly envy. Furthermore, without the manic possibilities of driving, we're vulnerable not just to the weather outside, but we're also vulnerable within to our own sense of limits and finiteness. When held in ecological awareness, the act of driving or not driving all too easily becomes a transaction of guilt and righteousness. And in this dilemma, I'd suggest that the continuity of our ecological awareness, which is perhaps already precarious due to the severity of the environmental issues, gets easily and frequently disrupted. And it is anxiety-provoking for me to talk about driving in this way, in a room which I'm sure has got a lot of car drivers in it. So, and someone whose advice I value suggested that talking about driving here in this way might be going a little bit too far. And I think it will be too far unless we can draw on a woman, Mimi Katzenbach's ideas to appreciate together the nature of tragedy. According to Katzenbach, Aristotle defines tragedy as the human situation in which a former source of happiness suddenly dramatically reverses into its opposite. That we never intend to engender miserable human conditions, but that there's a pattern in life that flips our pursuit of joy into misery. And I want to spend a little bit of time on this because I think there's a lot here. Firstly, that the tragedy of ecological dilemmas is a human situation, that it's part and parcel of being human on this planet in this time. There's also a recognition of loss when a former source of happiness has reversed into its opposite. There's recognition that there was no intention to create this misery, which helps us to not experience this ecological dilemma as an attack. And finally, a recognition that this is a pattern in life, this tragic pattern, and that the tragic pattern can be accepted as natural and inevitable in its own way. Katzenbach calls this the tragic flip from experiencing something as good to bad or back. And appreciating this may help it feel safer collectively and individually to be aware of ecological dilemmas such as driving. The tragic flip, like the flip between figure and ground, happens in our perception and can happen simply and instantly. But it doesn't have to end up in the tragic position. And I'll give an example. I might feel a physical, bodily sense of badness if I'm walking down the street and I become aware of feeling quite thirsty. So I might flip. I feel good when I find a dairy and purchase and drink some bottled water. Now, I might, depending on my values, flip again to feel bad when I find myself responsible for the plastic bottle that the water came in, which I'm left holding. Now, if I had a backpack into which I could tuck the bottle away until I came to a recycling bin, I might feel good again, but potentially back to bad when I contemplate the limits of recycling, or good again if I find a way to reuse instead of recycle. So it's a very small, very everyday example, but it might serve to illustrate the tragic flip that occurs around our everyday stuff, and also a potential here for our awareness to widen outwards. So there's a potential for a progressive movement from a place of initial magical wish fulfillment in which the market anticipates my need and fulfills it almost instantly, to a place of stewardship in which an everyday decision connects me to a wide ecological web. And at that point, if we get to that point, the plastic bottle that I'm holding is no longer stuff, but it's an object that's full of significance and symbolism. Now, I'm not suggesting that any of us always experience such a mundane event in this way, but I think this is a potential of ecological awareness. Both the driving and the water bottle are examples of very everyday tragic flips and ecological choices. And though they are extremely everyday, I want to relate them back to the story of Daedalus and Icarus, which continues on after Icarus falls to his death. His father Daedalus searches for him, but can only find a few feathers from the wings which float on top of the water. Grief-stricken, Daedalus goes to a nearby island to perform funeral rites for his son. What he does next, after that, is to make a sacrifice to the god of the sun, Apollo. So whichever way we choose, our own and our clients' everyday ecological choices have consequences. And I'm suggesting that when these choices are made consciously, that this is a sacrifice that can transform tragic grief into love. Now, coming back to the two answers I've suggested as to why ecological awareness is difficult to maintain. So, number one was the problem of idealization. And number two was the way the stuff of our world challenges and disrupts our sense of continuity. Now, the ecologically sound idea of interdependence may translate into the therapeutic idea of mutuality as an antidote to idealization. The moment-to-moment recognition of the tragic dilemma of stuff may help maintain continuity of ecological awareness. And thinking back to the talk last year, more than one person expressed a wish for discussion of ecotherapy to continue at further meetings. I think this was an expression of a wish for our continuation as a species. In ecotherapy, the fear of lack of continuity may be the equivalent of the fear of interpersonal abandonment, as we might explore in conventional therapy. So a frame that supports continued engagement with environmental issues and awareness seems to me to be a good fit with the idea of continuous shifts between figure and ground, rather than more of an idea of lasting change due to a moment of insight. This also seems to be supported by what outcome research we do have for ecotherapy, which says that changes in environmental mindedness after a one-off intervention, such as a talk or a workshop, is only sustained if there's some kind of ongoing engagement in a context that is supportive of that change. So this brings us to the next step in the journey of exploring ecotherapy. The next step being two ongoing, continuing initiatives, an ecotherapy peer supervision group and Circle of Change. The peer supervision group has been monthly meetings of a small group of counselors and psychotherapists, an environment for learning together through the discussion of clinical material how to formulate and intervene ecotherapeutically with our clients. Even in this context in which we've been specifically attending to environmental concerns, I've often found them quite elusive, as if the environment itself is invisible in our clients' stories. So I believe this is the effect of the human figure becoming rigidly isolated from the environmental ground in our habitual patterns of awareness. When the view has become this dim or elusive, then it's been hard to be specific with our clients. That is, in translating broad theories that locate the human species culturally, politically, spiritually, and ecologically within the web of life, translating these theories into interventions precise and specific enough to find the tender place in the heart of a conflicted, wounded, or needy client in our therapy rooms. So for me, this has been really hard. And without a guide holding a map for us, there have been frequent moments of disorientation where we've returned to the question again and again of, what is ecotherapy? But there's also been a joy of discovery. And in the process, our clients and their worlds of stuff and relationships with that stuff have at times been illuminated, revealing a rich web of symbol and meaning. For instance, relating to fertility, beauty, decay, taking and giving life, belonging, the animal and instinctual, just to name a few. So these conversations within the peer supervision group have, I think, helped develop our capacity to think symbolically about the just bewilderingly vast array, network of relationships that we call nature. And as Mary Jane Rust would say, our capacity to listen with the earth in mind. The other continuous initiative that I want to talk about is Circle of Change. This is an offer of 6 sessions of counseling or psychotherapy at $25 per session, which is open to anyone who identifies as a social or environmental change maker. So these sessions can be used to help with the challenges of making social or environmental changes, or any other challenges the client wants to address. Currently, I'm in the role of coordinator, and the coordinator has a phone conversation with people who make contact, then refers them on to one of the therapists or counselors involved, who then sees these clients in their private practice. As some of the same clinicians are involved in both Circle of Change and the peer supervision group, the idea is that this helps the clinicians to learn to work ecotherapeutically by connecting them with clients who are more likely to be open to this approach. And the other nice thing about the way this works is that clinicians can still support wider change through using their more conventional therapy skills by working with clients who are inspiring change makers in their own right, but who are presenting with more conventional clinical issues such as depression or anxiety. So you'll see a couple of these screenshots from the Circle of Change website that's just gone live recently. At the moment, it's some resources for therapists and clients. And it's also an entry point for clients who want to access therapy. But it will be expanding from this. And I really want to acknowledge and express my huge gratitude to, in particular, to Matt Fordham and Shobha Pillai from Roots Before Branches, who donated their time and expertise for free to create this website. And actually everyone involved in Circle of Change, the clinicians, the clients, and various support people, they've been really inspiring to me in their generosity and their goodwill, which is really what this initiative relies on. So the sacrifice of these people's time and energy for little or no money, it has been a sacrifice of sorts, though there's been little grief apparent to me in that sacrifice, other than that of already generous and often busy people extending themselves a little bit further for a cause that they believe in. So I've been really humbled by the amount of love that I've felt through being involved with Circle of Change. The final part of the story or journey that I'm telling is the most recent. It's about the 5-hour-long Deep Green Ecotherapy workshop, which I facilitated last weekend. 7 participants spent time in beautiful native bush on the grounds of a retreat center in the Waitakaris, practicing in this order mindfulness, then a solo period of immersion in the bush, and finally group processing of their experiences. So I'll kind of run us through that. The initial practice of mindfulness helped to interrupt our preoccupation with ourselves, getting us in touch with the uncanny quality of experience. And this uncanny quality helped to flip us from a vague awareness of trees and plants as the stuff of the background, helped to flip that into a really vivid foreground experience. And, you know, the vividness is not entirely safe feeling. Having at times a kind of subtly startling quality. The intensity of this experience of the bush was amplified for participants during the 1.5 hour long solo immersion period of the workshop. So for some, a fear of being bitten or stung by insects, or a claustrophobic fear of being engulfed by the bush came up. And I picked this image because somehow it captured a little bit the feeling of claustrophobia. But this seemed to be more than balanced for participants by an experience of peacefulness and stillness that one participant described as feeling warmly held by nature. I think this warmth, peace, and sense of space was probably due to a lot of things, but it was due to being relieved of an overabundance of human-created signs and symbols, which kind of cajole and demand from us in our everyday world of stuff, which has been constructed by and for human consciousness. So holding and containment in this workshop seemed to be created not just by me as the facilitator, but by the bush itself. The frame, in the form of the requirement to stay within a 5 by 5 meter area during the solo experience, required participants to come into a very intimate relationship with nature. And this was, I think, quite different from moving through the bush with a path or destination in mind, such as we might do while going tramping. And I think in tramping, despite an enjoyment or appreciation of nature, there's still a kind of subtle aspect of tourism, often. And I think that's what this bit of the frame, this requirement to be still in a limited space, helped people to get beyond. The centrality of the bush itself to the emotional experience of participants relates to the ideas of UK ecotherapists Martin Jordan and Hayley Marshall. They see the relational context of ecotherapy as expanded to include nature as a living therapist. So expanding to include this as well as the client and the human therapist. And to me, this idea really matched the experience through the workshop, in which at times nature as the therapist was the figure, and the human therapist, me, was the ground. but this would flip back and forth depending on the section of the workshop and in response to the participants' needs. For me, it was a really lovely experience to have such a talented and reliable co-therapist to share the load of running this workshop. When the group rejoined for the final process component of the workshop, we initially sat together in silence for about 10 minutes. And the group seemed really reluctant to kind of refill themselves with human-created meanings or to symbolize their experience through language making. One group member described the experience of being in nature as like being in the womb. And as this participant strove to find words to fit his experience, I really watched him kind of contorting his body and then discarding one phrase after another as he tried to find something that fit to describe this indescribable experience he'd had. To me, this illustrated the difficulty of fitting experiences of immensity into language. And also the reluctance to leave, on the part of participants, to leave the immediacy of the solo experience of nature by symbolizing it. Another way of looking at this might be as being the difficulty of once again flipping figure and ground, to have humans and the group itself once again become the figure. So the insights participants shared seemed not to come from looking inside themselves, but instead seemed to emerge as part of their perception of the bush around them. For instance, one participant talked about observing the busyness of the intricate ecosystem of the bush around her, which led her to a significant sense of relief from having felt conflicted about the ongoing busyness in the rest of her life. And interestingly to me, while the bush itself was a powerful factor in participants' therapeutic experience, it actually didn't just serve my agenda. And part of that agenda was to encourage participants to explicitly discuss environmental issues such as global warming and deforestation. And this was, though the group members had a significant commitment to an interest in environmental issues, they really seemed to me to be uninterested in discussing these things, despite my different prompts and interpretations. And in trying to understand this subsequently, I was told about some research by Nicholas, I'll say this wrong, Gauguin. And this research showed that discussing global warming in the presence of a dead pot plant rather than a healthy live one significantly strengthens belief in global warming. Which, to me, this is completely counterintuitive. But, from this I concluded that the setting of beautiful, pristine native bush had been having exactly the opposite effect that I assumed it would. So thinking about this leads me in two directions. Firstly, and most literally, doing a similar process group framed by the context of participants sitting on tree stumps in a clear-cut field, that this might be a powerful motivator for environmental change. But secondly, it made me think about the option of paying much closer attention to and interpreting the immediate environment of therapy. So knowing what I know now, I might have in the workshop remarked on how impossible it must feel to imagine environmental destruction and impoverishment whilst in such an amazing native forest. Or thinking in this way might lead me to interpret the context of my very everyday therapy room. So, and I'm thinking here about the compartmentalization, the apparent self-sufficiency of a closed door and regulated light and temperature, the kind of nondescript interchangeability of the 2 chairs and 4 walls, being much like any other room, and how these things in the environment might affect and reflect our experience of relationship with ourselves and others. Interpreting the immediate environment of either the bush or the therapy room may help to transform the kind of dead, inanimate quality of stuff by acknowledging it as a partner in the creation of our moment-to-moment awareness. Furthermore, for me, this opens a doorway to practicing ecotherapeutically in any circumstance, from the depths of the wild to the most run-down and neglected room in an agency. So I'll finish the story with a small sample of some practical ideas about the frame for those of you who may be interested in experimenting with integrating ecotherapy into your daily therapy practice. And then I'll revisit these 3 key ideas that I started with. So just going through some of these ideas. The UK ecotherapist Nick Totten approaches therapy as a meeting between the many physical, ecological, cultural, political, and spiritual systems which are embodied by both the therapist and the client. Thinking in this way may help us to go outwards in therapy as well as to go inwards. American ecotherapist Sarah Kahn practices what she calls an oscillating awareness between the personal and larger areas, such as political, ecological, the cultural, etc. And she notes that the tendency to pathologize personal pain is reduced when that pain is located in a larger context, which also allows many other hurts to be acknowledged. And she gives an example. When treating a client with a sexual abuse history, she says many spheres can be traversed, from the very personal sphere to the cultural, to the gender context, and then shifting further outwards into environmental abuse. Linda Bazal and Mary Jane Rost describe an assessment process, including additional eco-therapeutically oriented questions. For instance, questions about current and ancestral relationships with place, and time spent watching TV versus time spent outside. And clients may be surprised about being asked such detailed questions about their daily lives, as if they thought these things just didn't matter. But this can be the beginning of recognizing that modern lifestyles can take a massive toll on the psyche. And in terms of the frame, these questions can establish from the outset of therapy that ecological concerns do belong in the therapeutic space. So I want to finish this story with more story. So Icarus embodies for us the fatal flight too far away from the ground in the absence of any awareness of limits. And the depth of the tragedy comes from the witnessing of this by his father, whose own unsurpassed creativity is also revealed to have the capacity to extinguish life. And this makes me think of the role of scientists today, actually, of their creativity having played such a huge role in the development of technology, but also so many climate scientists being ignored in their warnings. So I think of them as being in the place of Daedalus today. But I don't really want to end solely on that note. Recently, kind of as an escape into fantasy from being too busy, I was reading the series of Percy Jackson books. I have no idea if anyone in the audience has read them. Okay, at least one nod. And for those of you who don't know, they're kind of like Harry Potter, but instead of with witches and wizards, they're with the ancient Greek and Roman gods. So this character, a satyr or a faun, in modern-day America, he fulfills his own and his people's lifelong dream of finding the lost god Pan, who is the god of wild places, who that they're convinced will save the environment. Now, except that when the satyr does find the god Pan, he discovers that Pan is dying. Pan says to the group of characters, including the satyr, that they should spread the word that Pan is dead, and that it's up to them now to save the natural world. So that's what they do. And because it's a novel for young adults, they succeed. And I felt a bit silly, really, kind of reading this and finding it so poignant. But I did want to share it anyway, as the witnessing of death flipping into something new, a possibility for life to continue, as it so often does. Thank you.
Just at the point that you talked about, the eco is the subject of therapy. From the box came, so I think the gods are with you. I know we have some time for questions, answers, comments, whatever. So,
yeah.
I think you want, sorry. Yes, we're going to get the mic in terms of recording. It really is helpful to grab the mic.
Thanks, Michael. I really enjoyed your talk. I love cars, and it's not without guilt. I liked how front and centre you sort of put that, and I also have a 2-year-old daughter, and I was thinking about, and I guess the question is sort of commenting on how much you think is possible within a generation and how much is possible across generations. I mean, I know there's an urgency in terms of the data, but I was thinking about how ingrained in me that love of car is as part of my person, as part of my identity, as part of my upbringing, versus the thought that I had when I was driving home the other day that for Pippa, she may never own a car. She certainly won't be able to afford to when she's a teenager like I was. And how much of a shift that will just create, hopefully, across generations as opposed to within.
I think one of the kind of dangers of doing what I've done is, presenting a scenario of the future is it probably gives us more certainty than we should have about what's to come. And I guess I was thinking, as you said that, about spending some time with a young nephew of mine cousin, sorry. Feels like a nephew, who is a little bit of a black sheep in my family because, he loves cars and that's his thing and he loves to talk about them. And, we got into this conversation about cars because it was something he was up for talking about. And, we began to get into trouble because the best thing, one of the things he could end up saying was his hatred of hybrid and electric cars, and they just didn't do it for him. And I could feel us heading into this really stuck place. And then someone else kind of chipped in and rescued us by, remarking about what great acceleration hybrid cars have, that they have this fantastic performance. And somehow that saved the day between me and my cousin. So I guess the reason why this comes to mind for me is that kind of sense of certainty that it's, as much as there's the story of Icarus and Daedalus and about the overstepping of our limits, some of the most important things are happening through people continuing to push those limits and, develop possibly more impressive cars which won't destroy the environment. So to me, that kind of is about a thought trap which we can all get stuck in really, really easily. I'm not saying you do, but something I've noticed within myself. Yep. The technology might provide a middle path, and I think it's a challenge to us to hold enough of a space within ourselves to think and feel not in black and whites. Yeah.
To add to that, being the owner of a beaten-up Nissan Pulsar that is some years old, and I use this quite a truck to go and get my pea straw for my garden and all sorts, and the seaweed from the beach, that there's maybe a lot of vanity in cars. That maybe we have to get over our vanity a little too. I certainly have some. I'd quite like a Volvo. But maybe I have some counter vanity by keeping my beaten up one. Narcissistic object, yes.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Thanks for a very interesting presentation.
Thanks.
I just wondered, I mean, this might not necessarily be the place to exchange this, but I just wondered whether you were familiar with the the Greek myth of Erisichthon?
No,
Not.
but would you like to explain it?
I'll try briefly because I'll probably take a bit of time if I tell the whole story, but essentially it is the myth of a Greek prince called Erisichthon, which means earth terror, terror of the earth. Oh. And it describes how, by disrespecting the goddess of the groves, he's cursed with an insatiable appetite in which he eats everything that he has, his entire kingdom, and ultimately himself, until he becomes nothing more than the sound of a furious wind. And I think it's a myth that in detail you could mine quite extensively for some insights and metaphors. That's all I thought.
I mean, thank you for sharing that. And to me, it makes me think of, one of the ways of thinking about ecotherapy as us collectively having an eating disordered relationship with the earth, where we consume and consume, but our hunger is never really met. But it's lovely, well, it excites me anyway to have these things personified, by the old stories. Also, the stuff about eating disorders comes to mind because of Mary Jane Rost, who I drew on, who I'll be doing a plug for later, who will be visiting early next year, who is a fantastic ecotherapist who works a lot with eating disorders.
Michael, thank you. I landed in here by mistake, and I'm very glad I came, because I was locked out of another workshop and I think I was meant to hear this one. I just had a few reflections. First of all, I was probably guilty of idealising you as a vibrant young man standing up there, and I was thinking, great, isn't it wonderful the younger generation are going to take up the torch. So I honoured that, I own that idealisation inside myself. Secondly, I've always associated the hubris with the myth of Icarus. And I wonder, obviously, if that's what has got us into this terrible plight. Like a lot of others, I was absolutely shocked by the map of the world. I guess that's what we've somehow experienced in Christchurch, that we could lose everything. Yeah. But lastly, your story that you read, I think it was wonderful. You read it poignantly. I don't think it's foolish at all. The great god Pan is dead. And then, of course, that was followed by Nietzsche in the 19th century. God is dead. And so we have to locate, however we name the nameless one, within ourselves and within the planet that sustains us. And I think you've outlined that absolutely superb. Thank you. It's given me a parallel tragedy to contemplate, because I think they're both interlinked. But I'm an optimist, so I hope that we do find a middle path. Thank you.
Thanks. And just to respond to that briefly, I think part of where I was coming from in mentioning the idealization is this kind of sense of, I suppose, as a younger person in this profession and as someone passionate about working on these issues, recognizing in myself a huge need for mentors and guides, supervisors, initiators, whatever we might call that. So, in a sense, not wanting to be left alone or left without that, if that makes any sense. Yeah. Thanks.
Michael, I'm not quite sure how to frame this, but I'm wondering if you would be prepared to comment on because of the way that you invite people to contemplate nature, to come into relationship with it, and the newer understandings about DNA and matter and how we actually are all part of exactly the same thing, stuff. In the last 2 years, I've been inviting people as part of, some people as part of their therapy, to actually contemplate nature, to take a question which may be theirs, it may be a systemic one, and contemplate nature, to actually come into relationship with it. So would you comment on that?
Sure, I'll give it a shot. I guess this reminded me of something in the workshop, and is also something from my own spiritual tradition, of Buddhism. And this idea of a koan, or a question, powerful spiritual questions which can change our relationship with the world. And one of the workshop participants found himself really struggling with his own question around, I suppose, existentially around the existence of death and what meaning there could be, in the presence of death and inevitability of death. And the bit where, to me, this relates to nature and maybe to what you've said, is that it was in nature that he was being confronted by death, by connecting with actually the vast amount of decay which is continuously going on in an ecosystem, in a forest. So I suppose as a facilitator in that moment, I felt like it was my role to feed his questioning and to kind of stoke the fires of it, which might be what the sort of thing one can do through, inviting a client to contemplate or visualize or what have you. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm struck by the synchronicity of it, because I could feel my belly just vibrating. And I recall that when I first sat with nature like that, that was exactly that sense of the place of decay, of change, of transformation and renewal, and the subtle and incredibly sacredness of that. So thank you very much.
That's awkward. I wanted to make about 3 different comments. One of them is that I think this is so tightly embedded or interwoven with political issues that we also have to pay a lot of attention to them. And the one that stands out, number 1 on my list, is the problem of overpopulation in the world. That we have something like 8 billion people now, and that even if everybody didn't have children, if they only had 1 or 2, it would still increase to 9 billion within the next generation or something. We have got to stop this somehow, which means we have to stop idealising having large numbers of children, which also means we have to educate women. It's just so enormously interlocked. So anyway, thank you for your contribution. I applaud voices that are willing to speak up in this kind of environment.
Yep, I think having children and environmental issues is one of the conversations which is kind of generally too dangerous for us to have. But I'd like us to find ways to start having those conversations. Yeah.
Thank you. We need to draw that to a conclusion. I was just struck by a couple of things. One is, as you were talking, I was remembering my son used to have a poster. My son, who's an adolescent, used to have a poster in his bedroom saying, "Why should I make my bed given that the world's in such a mess. And that was a koan for me every morning, And I was thinking, there is something about a generational thing that each generation does its best, but somehow manages to pass on the challenge to the next generation. And you talked a lot about idealisation. I actually think there is some realisation in you and in what you offer us. It is we need to make things real, whether it's about population or whatever. So thank you so much for a most stimulating presentation. I feel like this could be, the subject of the next, conference or whatever. But that's not my decision. So thank you very much. I know that Michael and Selena are going to America soon. All I can say is I hope you get back before 2100, because it looks a scary place to live. Thank you very much. Again, Michael. Thank you.